Hello, welcome to Pragim Technologies. I'm Venkat. This is part 17, different types of method parameters in C Sharp. In part 16, we had a basic introduction to methods where we have seen the basic structure of a method, the capability of passing parameters, and the capability of returning values back from a method. A method in C# can have four types of different parameters: value parameters, reference parameters, output, and parameter arrays. In this session, we will also discuss the terms method parameters and method arguments. Let's look at an example. Okay, now let's say I have a very simple method, public static, and the method is not returning anything back, so void, and let's call this simple method. And this method is going to take a parameter, let's say int j. And all this method does is if we pass it an integer, it's going to change the value to 101. That's it. Whatever value that you pass into this method, whatever integer that you pass into this method is going to change that value to 101. That's about it. It's not going to do anything else apart from that. Okay. Now, to call this method, since it's a static method, we can just refer to that method by name. In the previous session, we have seen to invoke static method, you can just use the name of the class. You don't need to create an instance of the class. Since we are in the same class, you don't even have to specify the name of the class. So you can either call it like program.simple method or simply simple method. Okay, so we need to pass it a parameter. So to do that, let's create int I is equal to 0. I have a variable of type integer which is initialized to 0, and I am passing I, that variable, as a parameter. I'm passing I as a parameter to this method. Now, console.writeLine, we want to see what the value of I is. Look at this here. We have this variable I which is initialized to 0, and we are passing that variable as a parameter to this method. Now, what will this method do? It will receive that value into this variable called j, and then it's changing that value to 101. So now, will that change the value carried by I? I is initially 0. You're passing 0 to this method. This method, when you pass a parameter like this, you're actually passing a value that is contained in this variable. So this method will make a copy of that value, which is 0 in this case, and then it does whatever processing it has to do. In this case, the method is changing the value 0 to 101. So j, so if you look at in the memory, the setup will be like this. If you pass by value, so I was 0. Okay, now I was 0. Okay, so I is 0. Now you're passing I to the simple method. So what's going to happen? This I is copied into this variable. So you have I is 0 and j is also 0 by the time you pass it there. And then in this method, this method is changing the value of j to 101. So j becomes 101, but I still remains 0. So if we print out the value of I now, it should print 0 and not 101, because we are passing the parameter by value. So a value is passed into this method and it changes that value. So only the variable that is pointing to this one gets affected, but not the initial variable. But on the other hand, let's make a simple modification to this. I am using a keyword called ref on this parameter, meaning this parameter is no longer a value parameter. It is now turned into a reference parameter. Okay, so when you call the method, you have to use the ref keyword as well. Okay, so now what is going to happen in memory? It will not create, now the runtime will not create two different variables. Okay, I mean there are two different variables, but they point to the same location in the memory. So first it creates a variable I, initializes that to 0. So what happens? I, and in the memory location it is 0. I is pointing to 0. Now since we are passing I by reference to this method, what's going to happen? This value is 0 here, but then since we are passing by reference, this method will create another variable called j, but that will point to the same memory location. Okay, so I and j are basically pointing to the same memory location right now. Now if j changes, okay, at the moment both I and j are pointing to 0. Now in our method, j is changing the value that is present at this memory location from 0 to 101, and I is also pointing to the same memory location. So if we go ahead and print the value, now it should be 101 instead of 0. Okay, so that's the basic difference between passing a parameter by value and passing a parameter by reference. So if you're passing by value, I and j are pointing to different memory locations. They are different copies. So operations on one variable will not affect the value contained by another variable. Okay, but whereas if you pass by reference, I and j are pointing to the same memory location. Though they are different variables, they are pointing to the same memory locations. So obviously operations on one variable will affect the value contained by the other variable. That's why in our program, though I is initialized to 0, since j is changing that value to 101, and in this example I and j are pointing to the same memory location, so I value is also 101. Okay, so that's passing by value and passing by reference. Alright, the next parameter type that we will look at is an output parameter. Okay, now when do we use an output parameter? Before we answer that question, let's write a simple method. Let's get rid of all these. Okay, I want to write a simple function which can add two numbers and return their sum. So how do I do that? Since I want the sum to be returned and sum is an integer data type, I will have int as the return type for my method. And let's make this static as well. Public static int. And let's say we will call this method as calculate int first number, int second number. So all I want this method to do is, let's say, return first number plus second number. So if you look at this method, this method is very simple. Okay, all it's doing is it expects two parameters to be passed in, summing up those two and returning them back. Now if I have to return just the sum, that's fine, but let's say I want you to write a method which can return back both sum and product. How do we do that? Okay, since a method can have only one return type, we can only return one value. Okay, so it's not possible to return more than one value. So obviously whenever you want to return more than one value from a function, that's when you can make use of output parameters. So let's see how to make use of output parameters and return both sum and product. It's very easy to do. Okay, these two are the parameters, the first and second number, and now I need to have out int sum and another variable to hold product, out int product. So what's going to happen now is we will add these two numbers and put the sum in this parameter. We will multiply these two numbers and put the product in this parameter. So let's see. So since we are using output parameters, we don't need this return type anymore because we will put the sum into the output parameter. So sum equals first number plus second number. So now this parameter contains the sum of these two numbers. Similarly, product equals first number into second number. So now this parameter contains the product of these two numbers. So now we can call this wherever we want. So if I have to call this method calculate, and let's say I want to add 10 and 20 and multiply them as well. Now look at this. Okay, these are the two numbers I want to be added and multiplied. Okay, now when they are added, we know that the sum will be stored in a third parameter and the product will be stored in the fourth output parameter. So we need two variables to receive those values. So before we call that, let's create those variables. Let's say int maybe total equal to 0, and maybe int product equals 0. So now what we can do, we can actually pass those int total and out product. Okay, so when you create output parameters, you use the out keyword not only in the method declaration, but also in the place where you invoke the method, you have to use the out keyword. Okay, and so if we want to print the sum and product respectively, we can say console.writeLine sum equals placeholder and product equals another placeholder. So sum is present in our total variable and the product is present in our product variable. So if we go ahead and run that, it should show the sum as 30 and product as 200, 10 into 20. Alright, so that's about output parameters. So if you want your method to return more than one value, then output parameters is the solution. And the last type of parameter that we'll look at is parameter arrays. So let's look at an example. Okay, basically parameter arrays, we have seen value parameters, reference parameters, output parameters. Now parameter arrays are usually decorated with params keyword. I mean, we use params keyword, okay, to create parameter arrays. Let's look at an example. Let's say I have a method public static void params method. That's what we'll give the name. Okay, now if we wanted to create value, output parameters, we use the out keyword. Reference parameters, we use the ref keyword. If we want to create parameter arrays, we use params keyword. So params, and let's say I want to create an integer array, and I'm passing numbers. Okay, parameter arrays. So now let's say I want this method to find out the total number of elements in this collection, in this array, and print those. Okay, so if I want to find out the total number of elements in the array, console.writeLine numbers.length property will give us the number of elements. Okay, and maybe we want to just say there are elements. Okay, and this placeholder will be replaced with this, and we want to print those elements as well, so we can make use of the for each loop. For each int I in numbers okay, so this is a very simple method. All this method does is it takes in an array as a parameter, and then whatever array that you pass in, it will find out the number of elements in that array and print those. Okay, that's what this method does. Since we have used the params keyword here, okay, actually, let's see. If I don't use the params keyword, it's like a value parameter. And now when I invoke this method, let's create an array first. Integer array, let's say numbers equals new int of let's say 3, and Let's initialize this array. Numbers of 0 is equal to 101. Similarly, let's populate the rest of the elements. 103. This is 1. This is 2. Okay. So now we have this array. Now if I call this method params method, now look at this. This method is expecting an integer array to be passed in. If I don't pass an integer array, look at what's going to happen. A red squiggly indicates an error. No overload for method params takes 0 arguments. We'll talk about method overloading in a different session, but what we need to understand here is that this method is actually expecting an integer array to be passed, but we are not doing that. That's why we get a compilation error. Okay, but if you want to make that parameter optional, then we can make use of params keyword. So if I use params keyword, then if I use params keyword, then even if I don't pass the array to it, it's expecting an integer array. Even if I don't pass an array, it's not a problem. So if you want to make your parameters optional, one of the ways to use parameter arrays. So if I go ahead and run this now, since there are no elements in this array, what does it do? There are 0 elements and there's nothing to print. So obviously there's nothing. And obviously another way to call this is to pass your array. So if I pass this array, let's comment this line. And by the way, to comment, you can use these buttons on the top. So if I run this, look at this. In this array, we have 3 elements, 101, 102, and those are printed. Okay, that's another way of calling it. Actually, the greatest benefit of using parameter arrays is that you can also invoke this method just by passing the numbers separated by comma. You can pass as many as you want. For example, let's say 1 comma 2 comma 3 comma 4 comma 5. Okay, so there's really no theoretical limitation on how many you can pass. Since this is an integer array, you can pass as many numbers as you want separated by comma. This is another flexibility that we have when we make use of parameter arrays. So if I go ahead and run that, so there are 5 elements and those are the 5 elements. Okay, but one thing to keep in mind when using parameter arrays is that this has to be the last. I mean, in case if your method is going to have multiple parameters, the parameters array should be the last one in that parameter list. For example, if I want to pass another parameter int x, okay, this is fine. But what is not fine is this one. You cannot have the other parameters in the end. Params array has to be the last one in the list of the parameters for that method. Okay, and you can only have one parameter as a parameter array. You cannot have another parameter array maybe of string type and names. You can't do this. You will still get an error. Okay, so that's about parameter arrays. So the params keyword basically lets us specify a method parameter, that takes a variable number of arguments. You can send a comma separated list of arguments as we have seen, or an array, or no arguments at all. Params keyword should be the last one in a method declaration, and only one params keyword is permitted in a method declaration. Okay, we'll also quickly understand the difference between method parameters versus method arguments, because this term is very commonly used, and if you're new to programming, when you read some articles, you might be confused. Okay, what is method parameter and what is method argument? Okay, whenever we declare a method, okay, here when we list our parameters, these are called as parameters in the method declaration. But when we actually invoke that, we pass values for these parameters. So for this array, we are passing these values. So this is called as an argument for this parameter. Okay, so in method declaration, we call it as method parameter, but when we invoke that, And when we pass values, those values are called as arguments for those parameters, so that it will be helpful for you when you read articles online. Okay, so we have seen this passing by value and passing by reference. So obviously in this session we have seen different types of parameters a method can have. There are 4 different types of parameters in C#: value parameters, reference parameters, output parameters, and parameter arrays. We also have seen the difference between method parameters and method arguments. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.